Welcome to Mile Marker 31. If you're a truck driver, you'll probably relate to some of the situations we share here. Our stories are fiction, but created by a trucker who's been to every single state across the United States. Today's story takes us onto the icy stretch of I-80 in Wyoming, where Mark and his son Kevin face a blizzard that will test more than just their driving skills. Don't forget to share your own road experiences in the comments. Tell us what you think about the story and say hello to our team. Now, let's get to it.
Chapter 1. The Father and the Son. The rumble of the Freightliner Cascadia filled the small Ohio neighborhood like the purr of a giant mechanical beast waking from its slumber. Mark Turner stood by the driver's side, one hand on the cold steel of the door handle, the other gripping a steaming paper cup of black coffee. He had been driving trucks for 15 years, long enough for the road to become as familiar to him as his own front porch, and just as bittersweet to leave behind. Mark's life in Columbus, Ohio was simple but full. His home sat on the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac, where winter's early breath had already coated the rooftops with a thin layer of frost. Inside that home was his world: Daniela, his wife of 20 years, and their 5 kids: Emily, 17, Kevin, 14, twins Luke and Sarah, 9, and the youngest, little Noah, only 5. The road paid the bills. It had bought that house, kept food on the table, and put Christmas presents under the tree. But it had also taken away birthdays, anniversaries, and countless bedtime stories. Every trip meant another goodbye, another stretch of days when Daniela was both mom and dad. This trip, however, was different. Kevin, curious, restless, and too smart for his own good, was coming along. It was winter break, and the boy had begged for the chance to see what Dad really does out there. Daniela hesitated. She knew the dangers of winter trucking. But she also saw the way Kevin looked at Mark, and maybe she hoped that spending time together on the open road would bridge some of the space the job had carved between father and son. They were headed west, toward Salt Lake City, Utah. Mark had hauled freight along the I-80 more times than he could count, from the flat farmlands of the Midwest to the snow-choked mountain passes of the Rockies. This route was always a test in winter, especially the stretch through Wyoming. Mark loaded their bags into the sleeper cab, making sure Kevin's duffel was wedged in a way that wouldn't tumble when the road got bumpy. Kevin climbed in, his breath puffing in the frosty air, eyes wide at the neat, compact space that would be their home for the next several days. "It's smaller than I thought," Kevin said, brushing his fingers across the fabric bunk. "Wait till you see how big it feels at 3 in the morning when we're parked at a truck stop in the middle of nowhere," Mark replied with a grin. The morning light was just beginning to cut through the overcast sky as Mark fired up the engine. The deep growl vibrated through the cab, a sound that was music to his ears and a lullaby to truckers everywhere. He checked his gauges: oil pressure steady, coolant temperature normal, air tanks full. Outside, Daniela stood by the front steps, wrapped in her long gray coat, waving with a smile that was equal parts pride and worry. Mark leaned out the window. "I'll call when we get to Indiana," he shouted over the engine. She blew him a kiss, mounting the words, "Drive safe." The first few miles out of Columbus were quiet. Kevin pressed his face to the passenger window, watching familiar streets fade into highways. Mark kept his eyes on the road, the hum of the tires against asphalt a familiar comfort. "So, you've been doing this 15 years, Kevin said finally. "Yeah, before you were born even. Back then it was just me and your mom in a tiny apartment. I drove a beat-up old cab over Mac, no GPS, no fancy screens. Everything was paper maps and CB chatter." "You like it?" Mark thought for a moment. "It's not about liking it or not liking it. It's about doing it well and making it home safe, always." By the time they hit the I-70 west toward Indianapolis, the CB radio crackled to life. Mark tuned it to Channel 19. A familiar voice came through, another driver he knew from way back. "Breaker 19, Breaker 19, this is Rust Bucket. Who's got their ears on?" Mark grinned. "Hey, Rust Bucket, it's Columbus Turner. Headed west this time, my boy's riding shotgun." "Well, ain't that something? Better teach 'em the ropes before Wyoming chews you up." The comment hung in the air. Kevin glanced at his dad. "What's in Wyoming?" Mark's eyes stayed forward. "We'll talk about that later." Hours passed in a rhythm of shifting gears, fuel stops, and the endless stretch of road. Indiana gave way to Illinois, then to the rolling plains of Iowa. Kevin was fascinated by the truck stops, the long rows of parked rigs, the smell of diesel, the buzz of conversation over diner coffee. At one stop outside Des Moines, they sat in a booth by the window, steam rising from their plates of hot breakfast. Kevin leaned forward. "So, seriously, what's the deal with Wyoming?" Mark set down his fork. "You've never been in a Wyoming winter storm, kid. Out there, the wind doesn't just blow, it tries to push you off the road. Snow comes in so thick you can't see past the hood. Black ice waits where you least expect it. And the worst part? It can change in minutes, sunny to deadly in the time it takes to drink that coffee." Kevin swallowed, unsure if his dad was exaggerating, but the look in Mark's eyes told him he wasn't. As they rolled west toward Nebraska, the weather began to shift. The gray clouds thickened and the wind picked up, nudging the trailer ever so slightly. The CB came alive again, chatter about road closures in Wyoming. Words like whiteout and jackknifed peppered the conversations. Mark kept his hand steady on the wheel, his mind already calculating options. For now, though, Kevin was with him, and the open road stretched ahead like a promise and a warning all at once. Chapter 2. Across the Plains. The highway stretched before them in a straight, unbroken ribbon, cutting through the vastness of the American Midwest. The truck's engine hummed a steady tone, a mechanical heartbeat that matched the rhythm of the journey. Mark kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sky merged with the land in a faint, hazy line. Out here, distances felt endless, as though the world had no edges. The further they drove, the more the land opened up. The small towns grew scarce, replaced by endless fields now stripped bare for winter. Rows of skeletal trees stood like sentinels against the wind, their leafless branches scratching at the pale sky. The occasional farmhouse appeared on the landscape, isolated, weather-beaten, and standing alone against the cold. The weather was holding for now. The air outside had the sharp clarity that came before a storm, the kind that carried a weight of silence in it. The clouds above were thickening, building in layers, stacking higher as the miles passed. Mark knew these skies. He had learned to read them long before weather apps existed. Traffic was light. A few other rigs moved steadily westward, their trailers swaying slightly in the crosswinds. Convoys were forming naturally, an unspoken bond between truckers, sticking within sight of one another in case the road turned hostile. Nebraska rolled out ahead of them, its wide-open plains offering no shelter from the elements. Here, the wind had space to run wild, and even on a calm day, it pressed against the sides of the trailer with a constant invisible hand. Mark kept a firm grip on the wheel, feeling each subtle nudge, adjusting without thought. Rest areas and truck stops became their markers of progress. The smell of diesel, the crunch of gravel under heavy tires, the low rumble of idling engines. These were the familiar notes of a trucker's life. Kevin, though quiet, was watching everything. He absorbed the details without asking questions now, his earlier excitement tempered by the weight of the road.
At a truck stop near North Platte, the signs of the coming storm were more obvious. Rigs were lining up in neat rows, drivers standing in small groups, their shoulders hunched against the wind as they exchanged news. Mark didn't linger long. He fueled up, cleaned the windshield, and pushed onward. By late afternoon, the light began to fade, even though the sun still had hours before setting. The clouds had thickened into a heavy ceiling, turning the world beneath into muted shades of gray. A faint dusting of snow swirled across the pavement, the first hint of what lay ahead. Wyoming was close now. The state line marked more than just a change on the map. It marked the beginning of one of the most unpredictable stretches of interstate in America. The signs along the roadside carried warnings about sudden closures and dangerous winds. Mark had seen them before and had lived the truth behind them. As they passed the final Nebraska way station, the wind grew stronger, its voice now a low howl that pressed against the cab. Snow began to fall in fine, dry flakes, carried sideways across the road. Visibility was still decent, but Mark knew how quickly that could change. The last of the daylight drained from the sky, replaced by the cold glow of truck headlights cutting through the dark. In the mirrors, the red taillights of other rigs flickered like distant beacons, markers of a fragile chain of travelers heading into the same uncertain night. Mark adjusted his seat, tightened his grip, and kept the Cascadia moving west. The road ahead was narrowing into a corridor of shadow and snow, and somewhere in that vast darkness, Wyoming was waiting.
Chapter 3. Into Wyoming. The state line appeared without fanfare, just a green sign lit by the glow of the truck's headlights. Welcome to Wyoming. Beyond it, the landscape seemed to change instantly. The openness of Nebraska's plains gave way to the raw, untamed stretches of the high plains, where the wind carried a different kind of bite. The road began to climb in slow, steady grades. The flat horizon was replaced by distant ridges, their outlines blurred by the thickening snow. The flakes that had danced playfully across the road before were now a steady stream, stinging against the windshield and hissing against the cab's metal skin. Mark adjusted his speed. His eyes flicked between the mirrors, the road, and the instrument panel. The truck felt heavier now, not because of the load, but because the road itself was beginning to resist. Kevin sat quietly, watching the swirling white through the passenger window. It was no longer the kind of snow you could see individual flakes in. It had become a moving wall, blurring the edges of the world. The CB radio crackled. A voice came through, faint but urgent, speaking of closures ahead on smaller highways, of jackknifed rigs on the back roads. Nothing yet on the I-80, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Mark didn't answer. He preferred to listen, to collect every scrap of information, and decide his course without the chatter of speculation. The wind was building now. It didn't just push against the truck, it shoved. Each gust felt like a giant's hand pressing on the trailer, testing its balance. Mark eased the wheel subtly with every hit, keeping the Cascadia straight, never overcorrecting. Years on the road had taught him that fighting the wind head-on was a fool's game. You moved with it, absorbed it, and let the truck's weight work for you. They passed a digital highway sign flashing in amber letters. High winds, snow accumulation, drive with caution. Another sign followed. Interstate may close without notice. Mark's stomach tightened. Wyoming didn't bluff. If the highway patrol decided conditions were too dangerous, they'd shut down the road, and hundreds of trucks would be stranded at the next exit, engines idling in the cold for hours, sometimes days. The night deepened. The lights from other vehicles became rare, each one a solitary spark in the white darkness. Snow began to build on the shoulders of the road, forming low drifts,
that the wind sculpted into strange frozen shapes. The sound inside the cab was a mix of engine noise, heater fan, and the constant hiss of snow under the tires. At one point, the snow thinned just enough for the land to reveal itself. Vast, empty fields, broken by the silhouette of distant ranch fences and the occasional lonely utility pole. In that brief clearing, Mark caught sight of a pair of headlights far ahead, swaying slightly in the wind. Another trucker, pushing west just as he was. Then the snow thickened again, swallowing the view whole. Rest areas became fewer, and those that appeared were half buried in drifts. The wind tore at anything exposed. Flags snapped violently on their poles, and loose snow whipped across the asphalt in ghostly streams. Kevin shifted in his seat, pulling his jacket tighter, though the cab was warm. The storm had a way of making the cold feel personal, as if it could find you no matter where you hid. Somewhere past Cheyenne's outskirts, the first true test came. A sudden gust, stronger than any before, slammed into the side of the trailer, rocking the entire rig on its suspension. Mark's knuckles whitened on the wheel, but he kept his movements measured, guiding the truck back into line as if coaxing a restless animal. The adrenaline surged, but he forced his breathing steady. Overreaction was how rigs ended up in ditches. The CB lit up again, voices reporting whiteout patches ahead, visibility dropping to near zero in some stretches. The tension in Mark's chest grew, but his focus sharpened. Every sense was tuned to the road, every instinct telling him that Wyoming was only beginning to show its teeth. When the exit sign for the next truck stop appeared out of the snow, Mark slowed, debating whether to pull in. The safe choice was obvious, but so was the fact that every minute spent stopped was a minute deeper into the storm's heart later. He kept going, westbound, into the wind, into the night.
Chapter 4. Whiteout. The snow had been bad before, but now it became something else entirely. It was no longer a matter of flurries or even a steady fall. It was an all-consuming wall of white. One moment, Mark could see the vague shapes of fence lines and the dull orange glow of another truck's taillights far ahead. The next moment, it was as if someone had pulled a white curtain across the world. Everything beyond the hood of the Cascadia vanished. The windshield wipers thudded rhythmically, their rubber edges straining against the ice building at the corners. Snow swirled in relentless spirals, whipped into frenzy by the Wyoming wind. The headlights didn't illuminate the road anymore. They illuminated the storm itself. Light bounced off the blizzard, blinding instead of guiding. Mark's hands tightened on the steering wheel, every muscle in his forearms rigid. His eyes darted from the road's faint center line to the right shoulder, trying to keep some frame of reference. But the lines were fading fast under the accumulating snow. Inside the cab, the air felt heavier. Kevin had stopped talking altogether, sensing the shift from difficult driving into outright danger. His eyes stayed on his father's face, reading every movement, every breath, like a silent observer in a cockpit during a turbulent flight. A gust hit them broadside, so strong it made the loaded trailer sway in its lane. Mark eased into it, adjusting his angle without overcompensating. He could feel the resistance in the tires, the thin margin of grip between rubber and frozen asphalt. The CB radio sparked to life with a voice that was more static than words. "Zero visibility, mile marker 353, trucks pulled over." Mark recognized the voice. It was the same westbound rig he'd spotted earlier, now warning anyone behind him. His mind processed the information automatically, mapping the distance in his head. Whiteouts had their own kind of silence. The wind screamed, the tires hummed, the wipers worked without rest, yet it all felt muffled, like the sound was being swallowed by the snow itself. It was an eerie, unnatural quiet, broken only by the occasional thump of wind shaking the cab. Then, in the ghostly glare of the high beams, something loomed, a faint, dark mass ahead. Mark slowed instantly, the air brakes sighing in the frozen night. As the shape grew closer, it became clear. A semi had pulled to the shoulder, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the snow, the cab nearly buried in a drift. Mark steered wide, careful not to get too close to the soft edges of the road where snow had piled deep. He imagined the driver inside, engine idling, waiting out the storm, possibly for hours. A safe choice, but not one he wanted to make yet. The Cascadia pressed on. Every few miles, the blizzard eased just enough to reveal another stranded vehicle. A box truck tilted awkwardly in a ditch, a pickup half hidden under a thick crust of snow, a cluster of cars parked together at a rest area like animals huddled for warmth. Mark's jaw ached. He realized he'd been clenching it for the last half hour. Fatigue was creeping in, not from distance, but from the constant mental strain of navigating blind. Every decision carried weight. Every mile felt like a gamble. Somewhere beyond the blur of the storm, a highway patrol SUV sat crosswise on the road's median, its blue and red lights flashing through the snow like a warning from another world. Mark's stomach tightened. Those lights often meant only one thing in weather like this: road closure ahead. But for now, the road remained open. The wind roared, the storm thickened again, and the two of them, father and son, kept moving forward into the void. Chapter 5. The Pullout. The wind had been howling for miles, a constant presence that scraped across the cab like nails on steel. Snow slapped against the windshield in chaotic patterns, sometimes swirling like ghosts caught in headlights, sometimes coming in hard, horizontal streaks driven by invisible hands. Mark's focus was razor-sharp, but even the best concentration has limits. His eyes burned from the strain, and his shoulders throbbed from holding the wheel steady through the gusts. The weight of the loaded trailer behind him felt like both an anchor and a threat, its mass keeping the rig planted, but also ready to pull him sideways if the tires lost grip. He glanced at the digital clock on the dash. It had been over an hour since the whiteout began, though it felt like far longer. The fuel gauge sat comfortably above 3/4, not an issue yet, but fatigue was. Kevin sat quietly in the passenger seat, occasionally sipping from a bottle of water, his face pale in the dim glow from the dashboard lights. He'd seen snow before, but never like this. A cluster of reflective signs appeared ahead, barely cutting through the blizzard. Their surfaces were iced over, but Mark could make out enough to know a pullout area was coming up in half a mile. One of those gravel patches on the side of the highway meant for chaining up tires or taking a quick break. He didn't hesitate. The thought of pulling over into a safe spot, even for 10 minutes, felt like a lifeline. As the turnoff approached, he eased the Cascadia's speed down to a crawl. The steering wheel fought against his hands as the wind battered the side of the truck. A narrow, snow-choked entrance appeared between two battered yellow posts. He swung in carefully, the crunch of compacted snow under the tires echoing faintly in the cab. The pullout was nearly empty, just one other semi parked at the far end, its trailer looming in and out of sight as snow swirled past. The engine's low rumble was the only sign of life inside it. Mark brought his rig to a stop, set the parking brake, and let the engine idle. The sudden stillness felt unnatural, almost worse than the motion. With the truck stationary, the full force of the wind became apparent. It slammed into the side of the cab with hollow booms, shaking the mirrors and making the entire sleeper compartment tremble. He leaned back in his seat, rubbing his hands over his face. His palms smelled faintly of leather and the bitter cold that had seeped through the cab. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to take a full, deep breath. Kevin shifted in his seat. "We're stopping here for the night?" Mark didn't answer right away. He looked out at the white chaos beyond the glass. The visibility was still almost zero. He could see the edges of the pullout, marked by uneven mounds of snow where the plows hadn't bothered to go. It wasn't safe to keep moving, but it wasn't entirely here either. If the storm worsened, drifts could bury the truck deep enough to make it hard to move when the time came. "Just a break," Mark finally said, his voice low. "Stretch, breathe, then decide." They sat in silence, listening to the wind's endless moan. Every so often, a heavier gust would make the cab rock like a boat in choppy water. Snow clung to the side windows, freezing into jagged patterns that looked like fractured glass. The other truck's headlights flickered once, then shut off, leaving only the dim orange glow of its clearance lights. Mark stared at it for a moment, wondering if the driver inside was sleeping or just conserving battery power. He thought about the highway behind them, littered with stranded vehicles, invisible except for the occasional flash of hazard lights swallowed by the storm. He thought about the miles ahead, toward Rowlands and eventually Salt Lake City. But most of all, he thought about the fine line between pressing on and pushing too far. After 10 minutes, he checked the mirrors. Nothing. No headlights in either direction. The I-80, one of America's busiest freight corridors, was a ghost road tonight. Then, out of nowhere, a faint light appeared through the storm. Not the sharp beam of headlights, but a soft, flickering glow. It moved irregularly, like a lantern swaying in the wind. It was coming from the far side of the pullout, near the tree line that was barely visible in the storm's haze. Mark frowned, leaning forward in his seat. "You see that?" he asked Kevin. Kevin followed his gaze. "Yeah, what is it?" Mark didn't answer. He just watched. The glow moved a few more steps, then vanished, completely swallowed by the storm. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind screamed against the cab again, louder than before. Finally, Mark exhaled, checked his mirrors once more, and muttered, "All right, break's over." He eased the truck back into gear, the engine grumbling as they crept toward the pullout's exit, leaving the strange flicker of light, and whatever it might have been, behind in the white void.
Chapter 6. Roadblock in the White Hell. The pullout faded into the blizzard behind them, its faint lights vanishing like a dream dissolving at dawn. Back on the I-80, the world felt tighter, the lane boundaries blurred into a formless gray that offered no sense of direction. Mark's wipers fought an endless war against the storm, squealing across the glass, smearing ice as much as clearing it. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the windshield, trying to pick out the subtle changes in texture that meant the edge of the road or the beginning of a drift. His knuckles were white around the steering wheel, his jaw locked in grim focus. Kevin sat still, hands folded in his lap, his eyes darting from side to side as though the snow might suddenly part to reveal something lurking ahead. Every now and then he glanced at the CB radio, but the chatter was almost non-existent. The storm had silenced the highway. The wind roared, now carrying with it a deeper, more guttural note, like the sound of freight trains colliding far off in the dark. Each gust slapped the trailer sideways, just enough for Mark to feel the weight shift beneath him. His mind kept running through worst-case scenarios, the jackknife, the skid, the slow, helpless slide toward a ditch invisible under the snow. A shadow appeared ahead, broad and low, growing rapidly in the whiteness. Mark's foot eased off the accelerator. The shadow sharpened into a shape, a large state snowplow crawling along the highway at less than 20 miles per hour, its rear flanked by flashing amber strobes. Behind it trailed a long, uneven wall of churned-up snow. Mark matched its speed and waited for a safe chance to pass, but the road ahead was so obscured that overtaking felt like playing roulette. The plow's wide blade chewed at the drifts, sending fresh sprays of snow into the air that instantly vanished into the storm's fury.
They crawled behind the plow for what felt like miles until Mark finally caught sight of an opening, a faint break in the blowing snow where the passing lane seemed just visible. He signaled, checked his mirrors, and carefully eased the rig around. The moment they cleared the plow, the world closed in again, a wall of white from shoulder to shoulder. He could feel the mental strain building, like his brain was a muscle pushed to exhaustion. Then, through the swirling chaos, two shapes materialized ahead. A pair of Wyoming Highway Patrol SUVs parked diagonally across both lanes, light bars pulsing red and blue into the night. The colors refracted wildly in the snow, making the entire scene surreal, like a police scene trapped inside a snow globe. Mark slowed to a stop, the wind buffeting the cab as the idling diesel rattled beneath them. One of the troopers emerged from his vehicle, his parka hood drawn tight, his face barely visible under the shadow of a fur-lined brim. Snow coated him instantly as he trudged toward the driver's side. Mark lowered the window halfway. A burst of frigid air slammed into the cab, bringing with it the sting of ice crystals. "Roads closed westbound," the trooper shouted over the wind. His voice was deep, but there was an edge of urgency to it. "Multiple accidents up ahead, zero visibility past mile marker 352. You'll need to turn back to Cheyenne or find shelter." Mark's stomach sank. The westbound I-80 was their lifeline. Without it, they were stranded. He glanced at Kevin, who looked more confused than scared, though the boy's eyes widened at the sight of the trooper's frost-covered uniform. "How long you think it'll be closed?" Mark asked, raising his voice. The trooper shrugged, snow whipping off his shoulders. "Could be hours, could be until morning. Storm's only getting worse. If you don't have to be out here, don't." Mark nodded slowly, the weight of the decision pressing hard. The boy's trip, the delivery deadline, the risk of idling all night in some pullout. Every variable collided in his head. But under all of it was the memory of the strange light they'd seen earlier. He didn't know why it stuck with him, but it did. The trooper gave a final nod, tapped the truck's door with his gloved hand, and trudged back to his vehicle. The snow swallowed him in seconds. Mark sat there for a long moment, the hazard lights ticking in a slow, steady rhythm. The world outside had become a white prison, and every second they spent there was another second the storm could tighten its grip. He exhaled through his teeth, then reached for the gear shifter. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than to Kevin. "Let's figure out our next move." The decision was made, though whether it was the right one, the storm would decide.
Chapter 7. Shelter in the Storm. Mark eased the rig off the main line and onto the exit ramp, the tires crunching through a thick layer of packed snow. The reflective signs were half buried, their letters only partly visible under the frozen crust. The ramp itself sloped gently toward a cluster of dim lights in the distance. A small truck stop, its sign glowing faintly through the storm like a beacon from another time. The boy stirred beside him, rubbing his eyes. "Is that where we're staying?" Kevin's voice was groggy, but there was a trace of relief in it. "Looks like our best shot," Mark replied, his tone cautious. "In weather like this, you took what you could get." The truck stop came into focus as they drew closer. A squat, low building with a single row of fuel pumps out front, all encased in wind-blown snow. The canopy lights flickered, buzzing faintly, their weak glow swallowed by the white curtains swirling around them. A few other trucks were parked along the far edge of the lot, but the snow had drifted so high against their wheels it was hard to tell if anyone was inside. Mark pulled into the lot slowly, feeling the tires fight for traction. He chose a spot near the side of the building, sheltered somewhat from the wind by a row of snow-packed dumpsters. The engine's deep rumble faded as he shut it down, replaced instantly by the eerie howl of the wind pressing against the cab.
Snowflakes the size of dimes slapped against the glass, melting and reforming into thin ice. "Bundle up," Mark said, grabbing his heavy coat from behind the seat. Kevin zipped his jacket tight, pulling his hat down low over his ears. The moment Mark opened the door, the storm punched inside, a biting, needle-sharp cold that stole the breath from their lungs. They trudged across the lot, boots crunching and slipping, the wind pushing them sideways. Each step felt like a small victory until they reached the glass door of the truck stop. Mark grabbed the handle and pulled. The bell above the door jingled weakly, drowned by the howling outside. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wave, carrying with it the smell of stale coffee, fried food, and something faintly metallic, like old radiator steam. The place was dimly lit, most of the fluorescent tubes overhead flickering or dead entirely. A handful of people were scattered among the tables. A man in a heavy parka with his hood still up, staring into a steaming mug. A woman in a faded denim jacket flipping through a magazine without turning the page. And a pair of drivers sitting in the corner, speaking in low, serious tones. The cashier, a wiry man with deep lines in his face, looked up from behind the counter. His eyes lingered on them a moment longer than necessary before he nodded toward the coffee pots. "Help yourself, it's on the house tonight. Storm like this, no one's going anywhere." Mark gave a polite nod, guiding Kevin toward a booth by the window. The boy pressed his palms to the glass, watching the snow spiral violently outside. Mark's eyes wandered across the room. There was something off. None of the customers seemed in any hurry to leave, but none of them looked relaxed either. They all had the air of people waiting for something they couldn't quite name. A low hum filled the space, almost too faint to notice at first. It didn't come from the lights, nor from the heater. It was deeper, more resonant, as if the very walls were vibrating with some hidden current. Kevin looked up from his seat. "Dad, do you hear that?" Mark paused, listening. The sound seemed to grow stronger the longer he focused on it, until it almost felt like it was inside his head. He took a slow sip of coffee, eyes narrowing. "Yeah," he said softly, "I hear it." Outside, the storm screamed against the glass, but here, inside this little truck stop, the noise felt different, almost like it was answering something.
Chapter 8. Whispers in the Whiteout. The hum was still there, low and steady, like the sound of machinery running far underground. Mark tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just the heating system straining against the storm. But the longer he sat, the more it seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. Kevin was still at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared into the white void outside. "Dad, I think I saw it again." Mark's head snapped up. "Saw what?" Kevin pointed toward the storm. "That light, the one from the road, it was moving." Mark followed his gaze, but all he could see was a swirling wall of snow lit by the dim parking lot lamps. No shapes, no colors, nothing that should have been there. Still, his gut twisted. Before he could answer, the bell above the truck stop's door gave a single sharp jingle. Both of them turned. A man stood in the doorway, snow clinging to his beard, his coat soaked dark at the shoulders. He wasn't dressed like a trucker, no cap, no heavy boots, just a worn leather jacket and black gloves. His eyes scanned the room in a slow, deliberate sweep before locking briefly on Mark and Kevin. Then, without a word, he moved toward the counter. The cashier didn't greet him, didn't ask what he wanted. He simply stepped aside and handed him a steaming mug, as if the man had been expected. Kevin shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Do you know him?" Mark shook his head. "No." The man took his drink and went to sit in the far corner, his back to the wall, his gaze fixed on the door, as if he was waiting for someone else to arrive.
That's when the hum in the walls seemed to deepen, becoming almost a vibration in the floor beneath their boots. The lights overhead dimmed for a moment before flickering back to life. No one else in the room reacted, not the other drivers, not the man in the corner, not even the cashier. It was as if this was normal. Mark leaned across the table. "We're not staying here long. As soon as it lets up, we're back on the road." Kevin nodded, but his eyes betrayed him. He was scared now. The hum rose slightly, like the sound of a diesel engine idling right outside. Except when Mark glanced at the window, there was nothing there. Somewhere deep inside, a thought formed, quiet but urgent. You shouldn't have stopped here.
Chapter 9. The Man in the Corner. The snow outside hadn't stopped. If anything, it had thickened, piling in heavy drifts against the windows and swallowing the edges of the parking lot. The wind was a living thing now, not just a sound, but a force that pressed against the glass and seemed to creep into the building through the smallest cracks. Mark sat still, his hands wrapped around his coffee, watching the steam curl upward and vanish. He wasn't cold, but his muscles were tense, as if bracing for something. Across the room, the man in the leather jacket remained in his corner. He hadn't touched his drink in 10 minutes. He was still as a statue, his eyes fixed not on the door anymore, but on the two of them. It wasn't a casual glance. It was the kind of look that pins you in place, that studies every twitch of your face, every movement of your hands. Mark could feel it like a weight. He glanced toward Kevin, who was still turned toward the window, watching the storm. But even in the reflection on the glass, Mark could see his son's eyes flicking nervously toward the corner. Kevin had noticed too. Mark leaned slightly forward and lowered his voice. "Don't stare at him. Just keep your eyes on me." Kevin nodded once, swallowing hard. The hum in the building seemed to have grown louder. Not enough for anyone else to react, but enough that it was now under Mark's skin. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a vibration in his bones, in his teeth. Then, without warning, the lights above gave a sudden harsh flicker. Not the quick kind you get from old bulbs. This was slower, more deliberate, as though someone had turned a dimmer switch down and then back up. The man in the corner tilted his head slightly, like he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too slow, too knowing, the kind of expression that made Mark's stomach twist. The cashier glanced at him, not with surprise, but with something like recognition. Then the man set his untouched mug on the table, pushed his chair back, and stood up. Every movement he made was unhurried, controlled. He walked toward the front door, boots silent on the tile, and paused just long enough to glance over his shoulder at Mark. His lips moved, but the words were lost in the hum. The bell above the door gave a soft jingle as he stepped outside into the storm. Mark turned back to Kevin. "Put your coat on." Kevin hesitated. "Why?" "Because we're leaving. Now." They gathered their things in silence, the tension between them sharp as wire. Mark's instinct screamed at him. This place wasn't safe. He didn't know what that man wanted, or why the air in the room felt heavier now that he was gone, but he knew enough to trust his gut. When they stepped outside, the wind slammed into them like a wall, biting at their faces and filling their boots with snow. Mark grabbed Kevin's shoulder and guided him toward the Peterbilt, parked in the far corner of the lot. But as they trudged through the storm, Mark noticed something that made his heart stop. There were no footprints leading away from the truck stop door. The man had walked outside and vanished. Chapter 10. The Endless White. The storm had swallowed the world whole. Snow pelted the windshield like a curtain of white fireflies, each flake slamming against the glass with a soft but relentless hiss. Mark gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles had gone pale, the tendons in his forearms straining. The Peterbilt's wipers struggled to keep up, smearing ice across the windshield instead of clearing it. The heater roared, trying to keep the glass from freezing solid, but the cab still felt cold, as if the storm had seeped into the very metal of the truck. Kevin sat beside him, both hands wrapped around his knees, eyes darting nervously between the window and his father's face. He hadn't spoken in a while. The boy who had been so eager to join his father for an adventure on the road now looked like he wanted nothing more than to be home in Columbus, surrounded by the safe warmth of familiar walls. Mark glanced at him, forcing a steady tone into his voice. "We're gonna be okay. Just keep your seatbelt tight." Kevin nodded, but didn't look convinced. His breath fogged the glass beside him. For miles, they hadn't seen another vehicle. The I-80, usually alive with semis, cars, and long convoys, was deserted. Every sign, every landmark, every mile marker was buried under snow. They could have been driving through an empty void for all the difference it made. But then, Mark noticed something. Up ahead, through the swirling white, a pair of red taillights blinked faintly in the distance. Relief surged through him. Another truck, another driver out in the storm. He eased his foot on the accelerator, careful not to lose traction on the icy asphalt. The Peterbilt rumbled forward, inch by inch, drawing closer to the lights. But as the snow thinned just enough for him to get a clearer view, Mark's chest tightened. The truck ahead of him was identical to his. Same model, same color, even the same streak of paint on the trailer's side. It was like staring at his own reflection moving down the road. Kevin leaned forward, squinting. "Dad, that looks like—" Mark cut him off. "I see it." The taillights flickered once, then went out, swallowed by the white. When the snow cleared again, there was nothing. No tracks, no vehicle, just endless snow. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. It wasn't possible. He wanted to stop, to pull onto the shoulder, but something deep in his gut warned him not to. Stopping felt more dangerous than pushing forward. And then Kevin whispered, almost too quiet to hear, "Dad, he's here." Mark whipped his head around, heart hammering. "What are you talking about?" Kevin's eyes were wide, locked on the sleeper cab behind them. His lips trembled. "He's in the truck." Mark's pulse roared in his ears. He forced himself to glance in the rearview mirror. For a moment, just a breath of a moment, he saw a figure in the darkness of the sleeper, seated calmly as though he had always belonged there. The man in the leather jacket. Mark's foot slammed the brake, the Peterbilt skidding sideways across the ice. Kevin screamed, the world outside spinning white and black. Somehow, the truck held, the trailer swaying but not toppling. They came to a violent stop. The cab filled with silence, except for their ragged breathing and the relentless wind clawing at the glass. Mark twisted in his seat, yanking back the curtain to the sleeper. Empty. Nothing but their bags, blankets, and the shadow of the storm filtering through the frosted windows. Kevin shook his head violently. "I saw him, I swear. He was sitting there." Mark's chest heaved. He wanted to deny it, to tell Kevin he imagined it, but his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Because deep down, he knew it too. And then, the hum began again. It was louder now, rattling the mirrors, buzzing through the dashboard, thrumming in Mark's bones. The very metal of the Peterbilt seemed to vibrate with it.
Kevin clapped his hands over his ears, eyes squeezed shut. Mark shouted over the noise, "Hang on!" and threw the truck back into gear. The engine roared, tires spinning, fighting for grip. Slowly, the Peterbilt lurched forward again, crawling through the storm. But the hum didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger, guiding them, pulling them. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, out of the white void, a glow appeared. Faint at first, then brighter. A warm amber light, hazy through the snow. Mark squinted, relief mixing with dread. A rest area, shelter, maybe safety. He pulled off the highway, tires crunching over ice and packed snow. The lot was deserted, the lights flickering dimly through the storm. An old sign, half buried in snowdrifts, read, "Mile marker 31, rest area." Mark parked and killed the engine. The silence that followed was suffocating. The hum had stopped. Kevin opened his eyes, staring at the sign. "Mile marker 31, he whispered. Mark froze. The number struck him harder than he expected. He didn't know why. It was just another rest stop, another lonely waypoint on a long highway. But it felt final. They climbed out of the truck, boots sinking deep into snow, and trudged toward the building. The doors groaned as Mark pulled them open. Inside, the lights buzzed weakly, casting the place in a dull orange glow. And there, sitting calmly at one of the tables, was the man in the leather jacket. He was waiting, hands folded, eyes fixed on them. Kevin clung to Mark's arm, his body trembling. The man's smile returned, slow and deliberate. His voice carried through the empty space, deep and calm, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You made it." Mark's mouth went dry. His voice caught in his throat. He wanted to ask who this man was, what he wanted, why he had been following them. But something deep inside told him the answers weren't meant for this side of the storm. The hum rose again, shaking the walls, rattling the glass. The lights flickered. Kevin buried his face against his father's arm. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything went dark. When the lights returned, the room was empty. No man, no sound, just Mark and Kevin standing alone in mile marker 31. The storm outside had stopped. The world was still, silent. Mark stared at the table where the man had been. For a moment, he considered leaving, getting back in the truck, finishing the run, pretending none of this had ever happened. But he knew better. Some things don't just vanish with the storm. Some things stay with you forever.
What do you think really happened that night? Was the man in the leather jacket real, or something that doesn't belong in this world? Share your theory in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories you'll never forget.